Chapter 1. The Woman Who Was Always There. Wychwood-on-Haven was the kind of English village where nothing truly happened, and that was precisely why its residents believed they knew everything worth knowing. The postman arrived at the same time each morning. The church bell marked every hour with reassuring regularity, and Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting, observed it all with quiet attention. Among the villagers, one figure had always stood out for her very absence of distinction. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a widow in her early 50s, quiet, unremarkable, and by all appearances entirely predictable. She lived alone in a modest cottage near the edge of the village, where the hedgerows grew slightly wilder, and the road narrowed into a lane that few bothered to walk unless they had reason. Every morning at precisely 9:15, Mrs. Carter would be seen leaving her house with a small basket. Every afternoon at precisely 4:30 she would return. No deviation, no interruption, no variation. It was the sort of routine that most villagers found reassuring without ever consciously thinking about it. Miss Marple, however, thought about it often, because predictability, when too perfect, often concealed something less visible. One Tuesday morning, Mrs. Carter failed to appear at the usual time. Miss Marple noticed immediately, not because she was watching for her specifically, but because such regularity had a way of marking itself in memory. The lane remained empty. The gate of the cottage did not open. The routine had broken. That alone would not have been remarkable in a larger place, but in Wychwood-on-Haven, even the smallest disruption became noticeable. By midday, Mrs. Carter still had not been seen. By evening, there was still no sign of her. The following morning, she was gone. Not merely absent from view, but absent from the village entirely. Her cottage remained locked. Her basket sat untouched on the kitchen table, visible through the window when Mrs. Hartley from next door peered inside. The village, of course, began to talk. "She must have gone to stay with relatives," said one voice. "A sudden illness, perhaps," suggested another. "Or a private visit," said a third, with the particular confidence of someone who knew nothing at all. But Miss Marple listened to all of it without agreement, because none of it explained the broken rhythm. And people like Mrs. Carter did not break rhythm without reason. 2 days later, Inspector Blake from the county police arrived. A quiet, efficient man who treated village concerns with polite patience but little emotional investment. He examined the cottage, asked questions, and wrote notes that seemed more procedural than concerned. No sign of forced entry, he observed. "Nothing missing," added the village constable. "Except the occupant," said Miss Marple gently. Inspector Blake turned slightly, acknowledging her presence with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Carter may have left voluntarily," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People who leave voluntarily usually take their belongings or leave a note." The inspector did not respond immediately to that. Instead, he continued examining the cottage. Everything inside suggested normal life interrupted mid-motion, a teacup half-finished, a book left open on a chair, a shawl placed carefully over the back of a seat, as though someone intended to return within moments. There was no sense of departure, only interruption. That detail troubled Miss Marple more than anything else. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Hartley arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, visibly unsettled. "I saw her," she said abruptly. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Mrs. Carter?" Mrs. Hartley nodded quickly. "No. Well, yes, but not here." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Where did you see her?" "In Wetherby," Mrs. Hartley said. "Yesterday, that name carried weight. Wetherby was a town nearly 20 miles away, a place where villagers from Wychwood-on-Haven rarely had reason to go." Miss Marple set her knitting down slowly. "You are certain it was her, Mrs.?" Hartley hesitated. "Well, she looked like her." Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Hartley continued, lowering her voice slightly. "She was in a shop. speaking to the owner as if she knew him very well. But she wasn't Mrs. Carter there. That final sentence carried the real meaning. Not Mrs. Carter there. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. What do you mean? She was called Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, Mrs. Hartley replied. The room fell quiet for a moment. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed more noticeable. Miss Marple repeated the name softly. Evelyn Marsh. Yes, said Mrs. Hartley, and she looked different. How different? Mrs. Hartley struggled for words. Confident, she said finally, like someone who belonged there. The phrase lingered. Belonging was not something easily mistaken. It was either present or absent in a person's manner. And Mrs. Carter had always belonged nowhere in particular. That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane near Mrs. Carter's cottage. The house remained unchanged, quiet, still, but now it felt less like an empty home and more like a place paused mid-story. She stood for a long time outside the gate, observing the closed curtains. Nothing about it suggested haste, nothing suggested panic, only absence. But now there was contradiction. A woman who lived one life in the village, and another life 20 miles away under a different name. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful as she turned back toward her own home. Because in her experience, people did not simply become someone else in a different town. They maintained both lives carefully, until something caused them to collide. And when lives collided, Miss Marple knew the result was never accidental. It was always revealing. Somewhere between Wychwood-on-Haven and Wetherby, Mrs. Evelyn Carter had been living two lives for a very long time, and now one of those lives had stopped appearing, while the other continued without explanation. Chapter 2. The second name Inspector Blake returned to Wychwood-on-Haven the following morning with a different expression than before. Less procedural, more attentive. Something about the name Evelyn Marsh had remained with him longer than expected. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, though she made no comment. Instead, she poured tea with the same quiet steadiness as always. "You've verified something," she said gently. The inspector hesitated only briefly. Yes, that single word carried more weight than most explanations. He placed a small notebook on the table. "In Wetherby," he continued, "there is indeed a woman registered as Evelyn Marsh." Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "And she lives above a small antique bookshop," he said. "Has done so for several years." The pause that followed was deliberate. Miss Marple did not rush him. "And this woman," she prompted softly, "resembles Mrs. Carter?" Inspector Blake nodded. "According to multiple witnesses, yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Multiple witnesses are often more convincing than a single one," she said, "but not always more accurate." The inspector gave a faint smile. "That is why I went myself. This time the detail mattered." He leaned forward slightly. "I spoke to her." The room seemed to tighten subtly at that admission. "And?" Miss Marple asked. Inspector Blake hesitated. "She denied ever living in Wychwood-on-Haven." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Just the natural pause of something not yet fully understood. Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. "And did you believe her?" she asked. The inspector exhaled slowly. "I believe she believed it." That answer was more unsettling than a simple denial would have been. Belief in one's own statement did not always mean truth. It often meant practice. Miss Marple looked toward the window for a moment, as though considering the lane outside. She did not hesitate. "No," he said. "Not even slightly." That detail mattered. People who fabricated stories usually paused somewhere. An adjustment of memory. A flicker of uncertainty. But hesitation was absent, which suggested repetition, practice, or something more troubling. A life lived long enough to feel natural. The inspector opened his notebook again. "There is something else." Miss Marple turned back toward him. "Yes, she has financial records under both names." The word settled heavily. 2 names, 2 identities, 2 financial existences. That was no longer coincidence. That was structure. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Explain!" "She has a small account in Witchwood-on-Haven under the name Carter," he said, "and another in Weatherby under Marsh." A pause, both active. The implication hung in the air. Two lives were not just being lived socially. They were being maintained administratively. Miss Marple spoke softly. "That requires intention." The inspector nodded. "Yes, and discipline," she added. Another nod. Later that day, Miss Marple requested to see Mrs. Carter's cottage again. Inspector Blake accompanied her. The house remained unchanged in appearance, but now it felt different to both of them. Less like a home, more like a compartment. Inside, the investigator carefully examined the few remaining personal items. Nothing had been disturbed since her disappearance. That, in itself, was unusual. People who vanish often leave behind disruption, unfinished movements, scattered belongings, signs of haste. But here there was order. Miss Marple paused beside the writing desk. A single drawer had been slightly misaligned. She opened it gently. Inside lay correspondence. Not many letters, but enough. Inspector Blake joined her as she read the top envelope. The handwriting was careful, precise, addressed to E.C. The inspector frowned. "Initials," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." She read further. The letter referred to travel arrangements, meetings, timings. Two separate locations were mentioned repeatedly. Witchwood-on-Haven and Weatherby. The same pattern again. Two worlds carefully maintained. The inspector picked up another letter. "This one is older," he said. Miss Marple turned toward him. He read silently for a moment, then spoke. "It refers to the arrangement continuing as planned." Silence followed. Arrangement. Not routine, not habit. Arrangement implied agreement. Miss Marple folded her hands. "So this was planned," she said softly. The inspector looked up. "Yes, a pause. For years, it seems." That detail changed the entire tone of the investigation. This was not a sudden disappearance. It was a long-term structure collapsing under its own tension. Later that evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. A young post office clerk from Weatherby, nervous but determined. He had traveled specifically after hearing of the inquiry. "I recognize the name Evelyn Marsh," he said. Miss Marple invited him in. The young man shifted uneasily. "She collects parcels regularly," he said. Inspector Blake, who had arrived shortly before, leaned forward. "And," the clerk hesitated, "she signs for them differently depending on the day." That detail caught attention immediately. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Explain." The clerk swallowed. "Sometimes she signs as Marsh," he said. "Other times she writes Carter." Silence filled the room. Inspector Blake frowned. "Both at the same address?" The clerk nodded. "Yes. The bookshop address." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the parcels?" she asked gently. "Personal items," he said. "Letters mostly. Sometimes small packages." The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Something was forming now. Not confusion. Structure. A woman maintaining two identities was not merely living separately. She was interacting with both lives simultaneously. Miss Marple spoke quietly, and no one questioned it. The clerk shook his head. "She is very polite," he said simply. That sentence revealed more than intended. Politeness often protected complexity. It allowed contradictions to pass unnoticed. After he left, Inspector Blake paced slowly across the room. "This is more than identity confusion," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." He stopped. "Then what is it?" Miss Marple looked out the window for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "It is maintenance," she said. The inspector frowned. "Maintenance of what?" She turned back toward him. "A life that cannot exist in one place alone." The words lingered, because they implied necessity. Not deception for pleasure, but deception for survival. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly with her thoughts. Mrs. Evelyn Carter had not simply disappeared. She had shifted visibility from one identity to another. and now both identities were becoming unstable. Somewhere between Witchwood-on-Haven and Wetherby, the structure holding her two lives together was beginning to fail, and Miss Marple suspected that when it finally collapsed completely, it would not reveal a simple deception. It would reveal the reason she needed two lives in the first place. Chapter 3. The gap between two lives by the third morning. The case had stopped feeling like a disappearance and started feeling like a pattern that had finally shown its edges. Inspector Blake arrived with a heavier file than before. The kind that suggested too many threads had begun pulling in different directions at once. Miss Marple noticed his fatigue at once. "You have been in Wetherby again," she said gently. The inspector did not deny it. Yes. He placed the file on the table but did not open it immediately, as though the contents required preparation. "I spoke to more people around the bookshop," he said. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And the story is consistent," he replied. "Evelyn Marsh is known there. She behaves normally, runs her household, pays her accounts. No one questions her identity." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is not surprising," she said. The inspector looked at her. "It is not!" She shook her head slightly. "People accept what is presented to them if it causes them no inconvenience." The inspector gave a faint, tired smile. "That sounds very like you, Miss Marple." She did not respond to the compliment, only waited. Inspector Blake finally opened the file. "There is something else," he said. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes? We checked travel records," he said, "between Witchwood-on-Haven and Wetherby." A pause. "There are patterns." That word mattered. Patterns were never accidental in her experience, he continued. She traveled regularly, every 2 weeks, sometimes more frequently. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, and no one in the village noticed her absence. The inspector shook his head. "Apparently not. Or they assumed she was visiting relatives." Miss Marple's gaze lowered slightly. "Which she was," she said softly. The inspector frowned. "In a sense." Miss Marple did not press him. Instead, she said quietly, "Tell me about the timing." Inspector Blake turned a page. "She disappeared from the village exactly 8 days ago," he said. "But according to Wetherby records, Evelyn Marsh was seen the following day." A silence followed. Not dramatic, simply meaningful. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "So there was no interruption," she said softly. "Only relocation of visibility." The inspector looked at her carefully. "That is one way of putting it." Miss Marple nodded once. "It is the accurate way," the inspector continued. "There is something else that does not fit." She waited. "In Witchwood," he said, Mrs. Carter had no known employment beyond part-time assistance at the church hall. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, in Wetherby," he continued. "Evelyn Marsh is listed as co-owner of the bookshop building." That detail shifted the structure of the case again. Ownership implied financial independence or hidden wealth. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "That suggests she was not simply maintaining two identities," she said. "She was maintaining two economic lives," the inspector agreed. "Yes." A pause followed. "Which requires funding," he added. Miss Marple nodded. "Always." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested to visit the church hall where Mrs. Carter had volunteered. Inspector Blake accompanied her. The hall was modest, with long wooden tables and the faint scent of polish and old hymn books. The church warden, Mrs. Dallow, greeted them with cautious politeness. When Mrs. Carter was mentioned, her expression softened slightly. "Oh, Evelyn," she said. Miss Marple observed that carefully. "Evelyn," she repeated. The warden nodded. "She was always dependable." Inspector Blake leaned forward. "Did she ever mention family in Wetherby?" Mrs. Dallow hesitated. "Not directly," she said. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "But indirectly." A pause. "She said she had obligations," the woman admitted. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Obligations," she repeated, that word again. It was appearing too often now. Obligations suggested structure, not preference, Mrs. Dallow continued. She would sometimes leave for a day or two. We assumed it was personal matters. Miss Marple folded her hands, and no one questioned it further. The warden shook her head. No, she's quiet, reliable. People don't question reliable people. The inspector looked thoughtful. That is precisely the problem, he said. Miss Marple did not disagree. Reliability allowed invisibility. Invisibility allowed duplication. After leaving the church hall, Miss Marple and Inspector Blake walked slowly along the lane. The air felt still, almost expectant. The inspector spoke first. "We are missing something fundamental." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." He glanced at her. "Two identities require separation," he said, "but she seems to move between them too easily." Miss Marple looked ahead. "That is because they are not separate in her mind," she said gently. The inspector frowned. "Then what are they?" Miss Marple paused before answering. "Functions." The word hung in the air. Not lives. Functions. That changed everything again. Later that evening, Inspector Blake brought news from Weatherby. A second witness had come forward, a shop assistant from the bookshop. She had worked under Evelyn Marsh for several years. She recognized Mrs. Carter from a description, he said. Miss Marple raised her eyes slightly. "And she insists they are the same person," the inspector replied. Miss Marple nodded. "That is consistent." The inspector hesitated. "But she also said something unusual." Miss Marple waited. "She said Evelyn sometimes forgets which name she is using," he said. A pause. "And when that happens, she corrects herself quickly, almost mechanically." Miss Marple's expression changed slightly. "That is very revealing." The inspector frowned. "How so?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because it suggests rehearsal," she said softly. "Or fatigue," the inspector added. Miss Marple nodded once. "Or pressure," she said. The room fell quiet. That night, Miss Marple reviewed everything again in her mind. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Marsh. 2 names, 2 locations, 1 person. But now the pattern was shifting again. It was no longer simply about maintaining 2 lives. It was about preventing those lives from merging fully. Because if they merged, something would become visible that was currently hidden. The next morning brought a letter delivered to Miss Marple's cottage. No signature, no address, just a single folded page. Inspector Blake arrived shortly after she read it. He noticed her expression immediately. "What is it?" Miss Marple handed him the letter without a word. He read it silently, then looked up sharply. "It says she has a child," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." A long silence followed, because everything had changed again. Inspector Blake spoke carefully. "From which identity?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "That," she said, "is the question they have been avoiding all along, and for the first time, the case no longer felt like it was about 2 lives. It felt like it was about what had been hidden between them." Chapter 4. The Child Between Names. The letter lay on the table long after Inspector Blake had finished reading it. She has a child. Simple words. Yet they changed the entire architecture of the case. Inspector Blake finally broke the silence. "If this is true," he said carefully, "then we are not dealing with deception alone." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "No," she agreed. "We are dealing with consequence." That distinction mattered more than most people realized. Deception could be maintained indefinitely if no pressure was applied. But consequence had weight, and weight eventually revealed structure. The inspector leaned forward. "We need confirmation." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said gently, "but not in the way you are thinking." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked at him calmly. "Official records will tell us very little," she replied. "People like Mrs. Carter do not leave convenient traces when something important is involved." Inspector Blake exhaled slowly. "Then where do we look?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her eyes had turned inward, thoughtful. "Into the gaps," she said at last. That afternoon, they returned to Weatherby. Not to the bookshop, but to a small clinic on the edge of town. a place where records of births, medical visits, and private consultations were quietly maintained. The receptionist hesitated when Evelyn Marsh's name was mentioned. "I am not sure we can." Inspector Blake showed his identification. The hesitation disappeared immediately. Within minutes, they were reviewing archived records. Miss Marple stood slightly behind the inspector, observing quietly as he turned page after page. Most entries were routine: appointments, minor treatments, general consultations. Then the inspector stopped. His expression shifted subtly. "Here," he said. Miss Marple stepped closer. A file had been marked under both names: Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Marsh. The dual listing alone was enough to confirm that administrative awareness of her dual identity existed in at least one institution. Miss Marple studied the page carefully. "And the dates?" she asked. Inspector Blake scanned them. His expression tightened. "These overlap," he said slowly. "Of course they do," Miss Marple replied softly. A pause followed. "But not in a simple way," the inspector added. Miss Marple looked at him. "Explain," he pointed to the entries. "Appointments under Carter are always scheduled in the mornings," he said. "Appointments under Marsh are always in the afternoons." Miss Marple nodded. "That suggests coordination." The inspector looked up. "Yes." A silence followed. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, simply revealing. Then Inspector Blake turned a final page. His expression changed completely. "There is a maternity record." The words settled heavily in the room. Miss Marple did not react immediately. She only said softly, "Read it." The inspector did, then stopped halfway through. His voice lowered. "It states, patient delivered a child under restricted identity protocol." Silence followed. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "So it is true," she said quietly. The inspector looked up. "Yes," a pause. "But the father is not listed." Miss Marple nodded. "That is not surprising." Inspector Blake frowned. "Why would it be omitted?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Because the identity of the father is more important than the existence of the child." That answer unsettled him. "Meaning?" She looked at the file. "It means someone did not want the connection recorded." A long silence followed. Later that afternoon, they returned to Wychwood-on-Haven. The village felt unchanged, but Miss Marple knew appearances were deceptive. A truth had been confirmed elsewhere, and now it would begin to affect everything here. They visited Mrs. Hartley, the neighbor who had first reported Mrs. Carter's disappearance. She was visibly uneasy when the subject of the child was mentioned. "I always suspected something," she said reluctantly. Inspector Blake looked at her. "Why?" Mrs. Hartley hesitated. "She was different after certain visits." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Visits from Weatherby?" The woman nodded. "Yes." A pause. She would return quieter, more careful. Inspector Blake frowned. "Careful in what sense?" Mrs. Hartley struggled to explain. "As if she was adjusting herself," she said finally. Miss Marple understood immediately. Not physically adjusting, structurally. Like someone maintaining alignment between two versions of themselves. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Blake reviewing everything once more. The inspector spoke first. "So she had a child?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and it belongs to one of her identities." Miss Marple looked at him. "That," she said softly, "is what we must determine." A pause followed. "Because that is where the tension lies," the inspector frowned. "Tension?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, between what is known and what is permitted." The next morning brought another development. A young man arrived at the village asking specifically for Mrs. Carter's cottage. He introduced himself as Daniel Marsh. The name immediately caught attention. Inspector Blake brought him in for questioning. Miss Marple observed quietly from her usual chair. The young man appeared calm but alert, controlled. When asked about his purpose, he answered simply, "I was told to check on my mother's property." Silence followed. Inspector Blake exchanged a quick glance with Miss Marple. "Your mother?" he asked. The young man nodded. "Yes, Evelyn Marsh." Miss Marple's gaze did not move. "And Mrs. Carter?" she asked gently. A brief pause. The young man hesitated. "She is also my mother," he said. The room fell silent. Inspector Blake leaned forward slightly. "Both of them?" Daniel Marsh nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you are aware they are the same person?" A pause. "Yes," he said quietly. That answer changed everything again, because it confirmed something crucial. The dual identity was not secret from all parties. It was maintained within a controlled circle. Inspector Blake's voice sharpened slightly. "Who instructed you to come here?" The young man hesitated. "My mother," he said. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which ones?" she asked softly. Another pause. "Both," he replied. Silence filled the room, because now the structure was clearer. Two identities, one individual, but also a managed awareness of both identities by at least one other person. Inspector Blake spoke slowly. "So you are not surprised by this arrangement?" Daniel shook his head. "No." A pause. "It has always been this way." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "Always?" she repeated softly. The young man hesitated. "Since I was a child." The word settled heavily. "Because that meant the dual life was not new. It was long established, structured, sustained." Inspector Blake finally spoke. "Then the question is not how she maintained two lives." He paused. "It is why she needed them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "And that," she added quietly, "is where the truth begins." Chapter 5. The life that was arranged Daniel Marsh's presence changed the room in a way no document or record had managed to do. Not because he brought new facts, but because he brought familiarity. Inspector Blake leaned forward slightly. "You said this arrangement has existed since your childhood," he said. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Then you were raised within both identities being active." Another nod. "Yes." The inspector frowned. "That is not something that happens casually," he said. Daniel did not respond immediately. It was Miss Marple who spoke again gently. "It is something that is maintained," she said. A pause. "Carefully." Daniel looked down briefly before answering. "My mother always said it was necessary." The word lingered. Necessary. It removed emotion from the explanation and replaced it with justification. Inspector Blake exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Necessary for what?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "For safety," he said finally. Silence followed. "Not disbelief, recognition." Because safety was the most common reason given for complicated lives. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Safety from whom?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "From family matters," he said vaguely. The inspector narrowed his eyes slightly. "That is not an answer." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I was told not to ask too many questions. That detail mattered more than any answer." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Who told you that?" Another pause. "My mother," he said again. But this time it felt less certain, less complete. Inspector Blake spoke carefully. "You mean Evelyn Carter?" Daniel nodded. "And Evelyn Marsh," Miss Marple added softly. A brief silence followed. Daniel looked up. "Yes." Inspector Blake leaned back slightly. "So both identities maintained control over your upbringing." Daniel nodded again. "Yes." Miss Marple observed him quietly. "Did they ever appear together in your presence?" The question landed differently. Daniel hesitated longer than before, then shook his head. "No!" Inspector Blake frowned. "Never? No!" he repeated. "They were never in the same place at the same time." That statement created a subtle shift in the room, because it suggested strict separation, not accidental division, but enforced structure. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And did anyone else know about this arrangement?" Daniel hesitated. "Yes," he said. The inspector straightened. "Who?" Daniel looked uncomfortable again. "People who helped manage it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Ah, that single word carried understanding." Because arrangements like this do not sustain themselves. They require support, infrastructure, cooperation. Inspector Blake leaned forward. Financial support, he asked. Daniel nodded. Yes, a pause. From both sides. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. Both identities contributed to the arrangement, she said softly. Daniel nodded again. Yes, the inspector frowned. That implies coordination, Miss Marple corrected gently. Interdependence. Silence followed. Later that afternoon, Daniel agreed to accompany them to Weatherby. Not to the bookshop, but to a small townhouse registered under Evelyn Marsh's name. On the way, he remained quiet, not nervous, contained. Miss Marple observed him carefully. You do not seem surprised by our questions, she said gently. Daniel gave a faint, tired expression. I have answered similar ones before, he said. Inspector Blake glanced at him. By whom? Daniel hesitated. My mother. The inspector frowned. Which one? Daniel did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, Both. The repetition carried meaning now. It was not confusion. It was structure. When they arrived at the townhouse, Daniel opened the door without hesitation. Inside, the atmosphere was orderly, not luxurious, not modest, carefully maintained, as though every object belonged to a system rather than a personal life. Miss Marple noticed immediately. This is not a casual residence, she said softly. Daniel nodded. No. Inspector Blake looked around. Then what is it? Daniel hesitated. Chapter of the arrangement. The phrase returned again. Arrangement. Always arrangement. They moved through the rooms carefully. In a small study, Miss Marple found 2 sets of correspondence files, one labeled Carter, the other labeled Marsh. Inspector Blake opened one. His expression shifted slightly. These are mirrored, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, that detail was significant. Mirrored correspondence meant parallel lives were not only maintained, they were synchronized. The inspector looked up. Why would anyone do that? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Because separation alone is unstable, she said softly. It requires balance. Later, they found financial documents confirming dual income streams feeding into a shared investment structure. Inspector Blake frowned. This is more than identity maintenance, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, it is system maintenance, he added. She agreed. Precisely. That evening, Daniel spoke more openly than before. I never understood why it had to be like this, he admitted. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Did you ever ask? A pause. No, he said. Inspector Blake frowned. Why not? Daniel hesitated. Because I was told it was not my place. Silence followed. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. That is often how such arrangements survive, she said quietly. The inspector looked at her. How? By ensuring the people within them accept limitation as normal, she replied. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone, reviewing everything. 2 identities, 2 financial systems, 1 shared structure. A child who understood both worlds but questioned neither fully. It was becoming clearer now. This was not deception for convenience. It was a life built under constraint. But the question remained unresolved. What required such a structure in the first place? The following morning, Inspector Blake arrived with new urgency. There is something you need to see, he said. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a legal document dated many years earlier. Her expression changed slightly as she read it. Inspector Blake watched her carefully. What is it? He asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Then she said softly, This is not about 2 lives. The inspector frowned. What is it about then? Miss Marple looked up. It is about what happens when one life is not allowed to exist in full. A silence followed, because now the case was no longer about duplication. It was about restriction. And somewhere within that restriction, Miss Marple suspected, lay the reason both identities were created in the first place. Chapter 6. The origin of the arrangement. The sealed document changed the atmosphere in the room before either of them had fully read it. Inspector Blake stood by the window for a moment, as though distance might make its contents easier to interpret. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, because she had learned long ago that important truths do not become clearer with distance, only with attention. When the inspector finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "This predates everything we've seen so far?" Miss Marple nodded once. Yes, the document was not recent correspondence, nor chapter of the dual identity records they had been examining. It was an older legal framework, a settlement agreement. Inspector Blake turned the page slowly. "3 names listed here," he said. Miss Marple already knew what she would hear. Still she waited. He read them aloud. "Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Marsh, and Daniel Marsh." A pause followed. Then he looked up. "This suggests the arrangement was established formally." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said gently. "Not improvised." The word mattered. Improvised deception breaks easily. Formal arrangements endure. The inspector frowned. But why would a single person be recorded under 2 identities legally? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was reading the clauses beneath the names. Then she said softly, "Because at the time, she was not permitted to exist in one complete legal capacity." The inspector looked at her sharply. "That is not a common phrase." "No," she agreed. "It is not." A silence followed. Then he asked carefully, "Then what happened to her?" Miss Marple's gaze lowered slightly to the document. "I think," she said, "we are finally seeing the beginning rather than the result." That afternoon they returned to Weatherby. Not to the bookshop, but to the municipal records office. The clerk there recognized Inspector Blake and immediately produced older archived files. When asked about Evelyn Marsh, he hesitated. "She has always been registered," he said. Miss Marple observed him carefully. "Under both names?" she asked. The clerk nodded. "Yes, since she first registered her business." Inspector Blake frowned. "Which name came first?" The clerk checked the records. "Carter," he said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. That detail mattered. "Then Marsh was added later," she said softly. The clerk confirmed it. "Yes." Inspector Blake leaned forward. "Do you know why?" The clerk shook his head. "No explanation was ever recorded. Just amendment requests." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Amendment requests from whom?" The clerk checked a logbook, then paused. "This is unusual," he said. Inspector Blake looked up. "What is?" "The requests came from multiple authorized signatories," the clerk replied. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Multiple signatories meant institutional involvement, not individual secrecy. The clerk continued. "Legal representatives, estate administrators, and 1 family solicitor." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Name?" The clerk checked again. "R. Latham." The name from earlier returned. Inspector Blake stiffened slightly. "So he was involved from the beginning?" The clerk nodded. "It appears so." Miss Marple leaned back slightly. "That explains the structure," she said softly. The inspector frowned. "What structure?" She looked at him. "Control distributed across multiple authorities," she replied. "So no single person could be held fully accountable." Silence followed. Because that was not just organization, it was design. That evening they visited R. Latham again. He did not appear surprised to see them, almost as though he had been expecting it. Miss Marple observed him carefully as they entered. "You have reviewed the documents," she said gently. He nodded. "Yes." Inspector Blake did not waste time. "This arrangement began with your authorization." Latham exhaled slowly. "It began as a protective measure," he said. Miss Marple studied him. "Protective of whom?" A pause followed. "Of everyone involved," he said finally. The inspector frowned. "That is not specific." Latham looked uncomfortable. "At the time, there were legal complications regarding identity registration and inheritance eligibility." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Regarding Evelyn Carter?" Yes, and Evelyn Marsh, she added. Latham nodded. Yes. Inspector Blake leaned forward. And the child? A longer pause followed this time. Latham looked down. The child complicated matters further, he admitted. Miss Marple's voice softened slightly. Daniel, yes, silence filled the room, because now the structure was becoming visible in full. A woman legally split into two identities, one maintaining domestic and village presence, the other maintaining financial and legal continuity, and a child positioned between them. Inspector Blake spoke slowly. This still does not explain why such an arrangement was necessary. Latham hesitated, then said quietly, It was necessary because neither identity alone could hold complete legal standing at the time. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Why not? Latham looked uncomfortable. Because of the original settlement conditions tied to inheritance agreements within the Fairchild-linked estate. Network, the name returned again, Fairchild. The inspector frowned. This is not just about Mrs. Carter. No, Miss Marple said softly. It never was. A silence followed. Then Latham added something carefully. Evelyn Carter could not inherit independently. Miss Marple nodded. And Evelyn Marsh was created to compensate for that limitation. Yes. Inspector Blake looked increasingly unsettled. So one identity handled restrictions. The other handled rights. Latham nodded again. That is a simplified way of describing it. Miss Marple folded her hands. It is the accurate way, she corrected gently. That evening Daniel returned unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. I was told you are asking about the original arrangement, he said. Inspector Blake looked at him. Who told you? Daniel hesitated. My mother, he replied. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. Which one? For the first time, Daniel hesitated longer than usual. Then he said quietly, Both. The repetition no longer sounded automatic. It sounded learned. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Do you understand why it exists? Daniel shook his head. No. A pause. I only know it has always existed. Inspector Blake frowned. That is not understanding, he said. Daniel looked at him. It is survival, he replied. Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke gently. Sometimes survival becomes structure, she said softly, and structure replaces explanation. Daniel did not respond, but he did not disagree either. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone reviewing everything once again. The case was no longer about a woman living two lives. It was about a system that required her to live two lives. A system created before Daniel fully understood it, and maintained long after no one questioned its necessity. The inspector was right about one thing. The arrangement had a beginning, and Miss Marple now believed she was finally close to it. Because somewhere in the earliest records of Evelyn Carter's existence, there was a decision that made it impossible for her to remain only one person. Chapter 7. The First Division morning arrived with a quiet heaviness over Wychwood-on-Haven, as though the village itself had begun to sense that something long stable was no longer intact. Miss Marple stood by her window for a long time before speaking to Inspector Blake. When she did, her voice was calm but certain. We are looking at the effect, she said softly, not the cause. The inspector looked up from his notes. The cause, he repeated. Yes, Miss Marple replied. There was a moment when one life became impossible to continue as a single whole. Inspector Blake frowned. That is still too vague. Miss Marple did not disagree, but she also did not retreat from the idea. Later that morning, they requested access to the earliest available records connected to Evelyn Carter's arrival in the village. The parish archive was small, carefully maintained, and slightly disorganized in the way old village records often were. The clerk, an elderly man with ink-stained fingers, brought out a narrow box labeled Residence, Historical Register. As he set it down, he muttered, She was always a quiet one, Mrs. Carter. Miss Marple looked up immediately. Always? The clerk nodded. As long as I remember, Inspector Blake opened the first file. The earliest entry for Evelyn Carter was dated over 20 years earlier. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. Was she known before that date? She asked. The clerk hesitated. No official record, he said, but she was here before registration. That detail mattered. Presence before record meant informal existence. Inspector Blake frowned. So she was living here unofficially? The clerk nodded. For a short while. Then everything was regularized. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. Regularized by whom? The clerk checked an attached note. By the solicitor handling estate transitions at the time. A Mr. Latham. Inspector Blake straightened slightly. There he is again.
Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the name was no longer incidental. It was structural. The clerk continued.
There was some difficulty initially with her status. Miss Marple looked at him gently. Difficulty in what sense? The clerk hesitated. She did not fit cleanly into any category. Inspector Blake frowned. That is not a legal explanation. The clerk shrugged slightly. It was what the paperwork said. Miss Marple turned the page slowly. There was a gap in the records. A 3-month period marked only as pending classification. She studied it carefully. This is the beginning, she said quietly. Inspector Blake looked at her. The beginning of what? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked the clerk, what happened after this period? The clerk scratched his head. She became a resident, he said. Fully registered. A pause. But something else was added later. Miss Marple's gaze lifted. What was added? The clerk hesitated. Another entry under a different name. Inspector Blake leaned forward. Evelyn Marsh. The clerk nodded. Yes. Silence followed. Miss Marple closed the file gently. So she was split? She said softly. Inspector Blake frowned. That is not a legal term. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it is an accurate description. The clerk looked uncomfortable. There was a reason, he said quietly. Miss Marple turned toward him. What reason? He hesitated. Inheritance complications, he said finally. The words were familiar now, too familiar. Inspector Blake sighed. Everything seems to return to inheritance. The clerk nodded. In this case it did. Miss Marple folded her hands. Explain. The clerk checked another note. There was a pending estate condition attached to her previous status. Inspector Blake frowned. Her previous status? Yes, the clerk said, before she arrived here. Miss Marple's expression sharpened slightly. So she was not originally from Witchwood-on-Haven. The clerk shook his head. No, she came here after a transition period. Inspector Blake exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Transition from where? The clerk hesitated. I am not sure I am allowed to say. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Then say what you can. The clerk exhaled. She was previously registered under a different jurisdictional identity. Silence followed. Inspector Blake frowned. That is a very technical phrase. The clerk nodded. It was how the records were written. Miss Marple looked at him carefully. Was that identity Evelyn Marsh? A pause. No, he said. The room became still. Inspector Blake looked up sharply. Then what was it? The clerk checked the record again. Evelyn Carter was the initial identity, he said slowly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the clerk continued. The second identity was created later but not under Marsh originally. Inspector Blake frowned. Then under what? The clerk hesitated, then said quietly, It was originally recorded as Evelyn Hartley. The name settled in the room. Miss Marple did not move. Inspector Blake frowned deeply. Hartley, he repeated. The clerk nodded. Yes, it was later amended. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Amended to Marsh. The clerk confirmed it. Yes, silence followed, because now the structure had shifted again. Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Hartley, Evelyn Marsh, 3 identities, not 2. Inspector Blake spoke slowly. This is no longer duplication, he said. Miss Marple nodded. No, a pause. It is progression. The inspector looked at her. Meaning? Miss Marple's voice was quiet. One identity replaced another when circumstances changed. The inspector frowned. And Hartley? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was thinking. Then she said softly, Hartley may not have been a separate identity in the emotional sense. A pause. It may have been a transitional one. Silence followed. That afternoon they returned once more to R. Latham. This time his demeanor was less guarded, more resigned. Miss Marple placed the new record on the table. He read it carefully, then sighed. I had hoped that version would remain buried. Inspector Blake frowned. So it is true, Latham nodded. Yes. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Explain Hartley. Latham hesitated. That was an administrative identity adjustment during restructuring of her legal standing. Inspector Blake frowned. Why was restructuring necessary? Latham looked tired. Because her original status could not support the obligations placed upon her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And those obligations created Hartley. Yes. A pause. And Hartley evolved into Marsh, she added. Latham nodded again. Yes. Silence followed, because now the truth was clearer. Not a woman with two lives, but a woman whose identity was modified to meet external demands. Inspector Blake spoke carefully. Then where does the child fit into this structure? Latham looked away slightly. That was the point at which control became difficult. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Because of inheritance. Latham nodded. Yes, silence settled. Miss Marple finally said softly, so the system did not begin with deception. A pause. It began with necessity. Latham looked at her. Yes. Later that evening, Miss Marple stood alone once more by the window. 3 identities now formed a pattern, not confusion. Sequence. Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Hartley, Evelyn Marsh, each one shaped by increasing pressure. Each one adjusted for survival within a system that did not accommodate a single complete existence. And somewhere in that progression, Miss Marple realized the idea of 2 lives was too simple. There had always been more, and each one existed because something or someone had made the previous one insufficient. Chapter 8. The unrecorded pressure. The discovery of a third identity had changed the investigation in a way that neither Miss Marple nor Inspector Blake could ignore. What had begun as an unusual case of double life now carried the weight of something far more structured, almost administrative in nature. Inspector Blake arrived early that morning, holding a fresh bundle of correspondence retrieved from county storage. I think we've been looking at this too narrowly, he said as he entered. Miss Marple looked up calmly. That is usually where the truth hides, she replied. He placed the bundle on the table. These are advisory notes, he said. Internal communications between the solicitor, estate representatives, and local registry officials. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Then they will tell us what official records do not. The inspector opened the first page. His expression shifted almost immediately. This refers to identity instability risks, he said. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, but her attention sharpened. Continue, she said softly. Inspector Blake read on. The subject demonstrates overlapping residential and financial obligations under multiple jurisdictional entries. He paused. That is about her. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the inspector frowned. And this is considered a risk, Miss Marple replied gently. Only if the system requires singular identity stability. A silence followed, because that statement revealed the core tension. The system did require stability, and Evelyn, under whatever name, did not conform to it. Inspector Blake turned another page. This is from R. Latham, he said. Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. What does he say? The inspector read carefully. Recommendation. Partition identity responsibilities to ensure compliance with estate obligations and prevent legal conflict. He looked up. This is where it begins. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said quietly. This is the moment the structure becomes deliberate. The inspector leaned back slightly. So Hartley was not a natural development. No, Miss Marple agreed. It was engineered. That word hung in the air. Engineered suggested intent, planning, execution.
Not accident.
Inspector Blake frowned. But why not simply resolve the legal conflict instead of creating another identity? Miss Marple folded her hands. Because resolution requires clarity, she said gently. And clarity may have been undesirable. A pause followed. The inspector studied her. Undesirable to whom? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said quietly, to those managing the estate's obligations. That afternoon they visited Weatherby again. The bookshop was quiet, its windows filled with neatly arranged antiquarian volumes. The woman known as Evelyn Marsh was present, composed, unhurried, entirely at ease. When Inspector Blake introduced himself, she did not react with surprise, only mild curiosity. Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was no hesitation in her manner, no fragmentation, only continuity.
Inspector Blake began the questioning gently.
Mrs. Marsh, he said, we are reviewing historical records connected to your identity. She nodded politely. Yes, I was informed this might happen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly at that phrasing. Informed, she repeated softly. The woman turned her gaze to Miss Marple. Yes, she said simply. I was expecting it. Inspector Blake frowned. By whom? She hesitated for the first time, then said quietly, my solicitor.
That answer aligned with what they already knew. But something about her calmness remained unsettling. Inspector Blake continued.
We have found references to another identity. Evelyn Carter. A pause followed. The woman nodded once. Yes, no denial, no confusion. Only acknowledgement. Miss Marple spoke gently. And Evelyn Hartley. The woman's expression shifted slightly. An interim administrative designation, she said. Inspector Blake exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. So you are aware of all three? Yes, she said. Silence followed, because this was no longer hidden life. It was acknowledged structure. Inspector Blake leaned forward slightly. Do you consider them separate lives? She considered this carefully. No, she said at last. They are aspects. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. Aspects of what? The woman paused. Responsibility, she said. The word was simple, but its weight was heavy. Inspector Blake frowned. Responsibility for what? She hesitated. For what was agreed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Agreed by whom? Another pause. Those involved, she said. Inspector Blake exhaled slowly. That is not an answer. The woman's expression remained calm. It is the only one I can give. Silence followed. Later, after they left the bookshop, Inspector Blake spoke quietly. She knows more than she is saying. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but she is not hiding it in the usual way, he added. Miss Marple agreed. No. A pause. She is operating within boundaries, she said softly. The inspector frowned. Boundaries? Yes, Miss Marple replied. Defined ones. That evening they returned once more to R. Latham. This time, he was waiting, as though the investigation had finally reached the point he had long expected. Miss Marple placed the latest findings on the table. He read them without expression, then sighed. It was never meant to become this visible, he said quietly. Inspector Blake frowned. What exactly was meant to happen? Latham hesitated. A managed separation of obligations, he said. Miss Marple nodded slightly. And instead it became a life system. Yes, he admitted. Silence followed. Inspector Blake leaned forward. Who authorized this structure?
Latham hesitated, then said quietly, the estate trustees and legal oversight committee. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And who initiated it?
A pause. Latham looked down. I did. Silence filled the room. Inspector Blake stiffened slightly. So you created the system? Latham nodded slowly. Yes. Miss Marple remained calm. Why? He exhaled. Because without it, she could not legally fulfill all obligations placed upon her at the time. Inspector Blake frowned. Why were there multiple obligations? Latham hesitated. Because of inheritance entanglements linked to prior family arrangements, Miss Marple spoke softly. Again, Inheritance. Latham nodded. Yes. Inspector Blake looked increasingly frustrated. This still does not explain why a single person needed 3 identities. Latham looked tired. Because each obligation required distinct legal recognition, he said. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, and the system could not accommodate unity. Latham nodded. No. A silence followed, because that was the core truth. Not deception, not betrayal, but incompatibility between legal structure and lived reality. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone once more. The woman they had once thought of as Mrs. Carter was not simply living 2 lives. She was maintaining multiple structured identities because the system that governed her existence required it. And now, Miss Marple suspected, the final piece was not about how the identities were formed, but what happened when one of those structures began to fail. Chapter 9. The Failure of Balance. By the 9th stage of the investigation, Witchwood-on-Haven no longer felt like a village with a mystery. It felt like a system under strain. Inspector Blake arrived with a sealed envelope marked urgent legal retrieval, his expression more serious than before. There's been a development, he said quietly. Miss Marple looked up at once. Yes? He placed the envelope on the table but did not open it immediately, as if even holding it required care. This comes from the Oversight Committee archives, he said. The original group that authorized the identity structure. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then it will explain the purpose more clearly than anything else so far. The inspector opened the file. What followed was silence for a long moment as he read. Then his expression tightened slightly. This is a warning document, he said. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Read it, she said softly. Inspector Blake complied. If identity separation collapses, all dependent legal and financial structures will destabilize. He looked up. That is the key concern, Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A pause followed. Continue, she added. He read further. Subject must remain operational under dual recognition framework to preserve estate continuity and dependent obligations. The inspector frowned. That sounds less like identity management and more like containment. Miss Marple agreed quietly. It is containment dressed as administration. Silence followed. Inspector Blake turned another page. This is the most important part, he said. Miss Marple waited. He read slowly. Failure to maintain separation may result in exposure of previously undisclosed familial linkage affecting inheritance legitimacy and trustee liability. He paused. That sounds like legal risk escalation. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, but more importantly, she added softly, it explains fear. The inspector looked at her. Fear of what exactly? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Then she said, Fear of unity. The inspector frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does, Miss Marple replied gently. If her identity becomes singular, then all obligations converge into one accountable legal entity. A pause, and that entity may not have been acceptable to the system at the time. The inspector exhaled slowly, so the split was protective. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not for her alone. A silence followed. That afternoon, they returned to Weatherby. The bookshop was quieter than usual. Evelyn Marsh was present, but this time there was something different in her demeanor. Less ease, more awareness, as if she already knew the conversation would be different. Inspector Blake did not waste time. We have seen the oversight documentation, he said. She nodded. I expected that. Miss Marple observed her carefully. You expected it to become public? She asked softly. A pause. Yes, she said. Inspector Blake frowned. And yet you maintained the structure. Another pause. Yes, that single word carried acceptance rather than defense. Miss Marple's voice softened slightly. Even though it was unstable. The woman looked at her directly. It was always unstable, she said. Silence followed. Inspector Blake leaned forward slightly. What changed recently? This time she hesitated longer. External review activity increased, she said finally. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, meaning someone outside the system began investigating. The woman nodded. Yes. Inspector Blake frowned, which explains Mrs. Carter's disappearance. The woman shook her head slightly. No, she said quietly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Then what does it explain? A pause followed. Reclassification acceleration, she said. The words were technical. Controlled. Inspector Blake frowned. Reclassification of what? She hesitated. Identity consolidation was being considered. Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke softly. Consolidation into one identity, the woman nodded. Yes. Inspector Blake looked uneasy, and that would have removed the separation entirely. Yes, Miss Marple folded her hands. And who would have been affected? A pause followed. Everyone connected to the arrangement, the woman said. Inspector Blake frowned. Which includes your son? The woman nodded. Yes. That detail shifted the emotional weight of the room. Miss Marple spoke gently. So Daniel is not just a witness. The woman looked at her carefully. No, she said quietly. He is the reason the structure exists at all. Silence followed. That was new. Inspector Blake leaned forward. Explain. She hesitated. His existence required legal accommodation that did not fit within a single identity. Structure, she said. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. So the system was built around him. The woman nodded. Yes.
A long silence followed, because now the origin point had shifted again. It was no longer inheritance, it was legitimacy. Later that evening,
Daniel returned unexpectedly. He looked more unsettled than before. They are talking about consolidation, he said immediately. Inspector Blake looked up. Yes. Daniel exhaled. That cannot happen. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Why not? He hesitated. Because it would make one version of her legally invalid. Silence followed. Inspector Blake frowned. One version? Daniel looked uncomfortable. Yes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Which one? He did not answer immediately. Then quietly. The one that remains here. A pause. And the one in Weatherby? He shook his head. That one carries the financial structure. Silence followed. Because now the arrangement was collapsing into conflict. Not duplication, division of function. And those functions were becoming incompatible. Inspector Blake spoke carefully. So the system is failing. Daniel nodded. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands. And that is why she disappeared. Daniel hesitated. Yes. A pause. To prevent consolidation. That statement changed everything again. Because disappearance was no longer mystery. It was intervention. Later that night, Miss Marple sat alone with the files spread before her. 3 identities had become 2 functions. 2 functions were now in conflict, and conflict, she knew, always sought resolution. The only question remaining was what form that resolution would take. Because when systems like this collapse, Miss Marple understood, they do not simply end. They reveal what they were built to protect. Chapter 10. The Point of Collapse. By the 10th stage of the investigation, nothing in Witchwood-on-Haven felt stable anymore. Even the familiar rhythm of village life seemed slightly altered, as though the air itself had absorbed the strain of hidden truths being brought too close to the surface. Inspector Blake arrived without his usual calm efficiency. He looked for the first time genuinely unsettled. They've initiated consolidation review procedures, he said immediately. Miss Marple looked up from her chair. Yes, she replied softly, as though she had expected it. He placed a fresh document on the table. This is the final notice from the Oversight Committee, he said. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The tone of the document was different from earlier ones. Less explanatory, more decisive. She read silently for a long time. Inspector Blake watched her. Well, he asked finally. Miss Marple placed the paper down. This is not a warning, she said quietly. The inspector frowned. What is it then? A decision, she replied. A pause followed. Inspector Blake leaned forward. Read it aloud, he said. Miss Marple complied gently. Due to increased external exposure and internal inconsistency, dual identity framework is no longer sustainable. Consolidation of Evelyn Carter and Evelyn Marsh is to be completed within legal compliance window.
Silence filled the room. Inspector Blake exhaled slowly.
So it is ending.
Miss Marple nodded once.
Yes, a pause. And Daniel. The inspector looked down at the document again. Dependent linkage subject must be reassessed following consolidation. He looked up sharply. That sounds like he will be affected directly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, silence followed, because now the structure was collapsing into consequence. Not abstraction, not administration. Consequence. That afternoon, they returned to Weatherby immediately. The bookshop was closed. A handwritten notice on the door read, "Temporary closure due to administrative review." Inspector Blake knocked firmly. No response. Miss Marple observed the building quietly. "She is inside," she said softly. The inspector frowned. "How do you know?" Miss Marple gestured slightly toward the windows. "No lights left on in the upper floor," she said. "But curtains have not been fully drawn." A pause. "She is waiting." Inspector Blake knocked again. This time footsteps were heard. The door opened slowly. Evelyn Marsh stood there, but something about her expression had changed. Less composed, more restrained, as though she was holding herself together carefully. Inspector Blake did not waste time. "We have the final directive," he said. She nodded. "I know." Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "Then you understand what is coming?" Another nod. "Yes." A pause followed. Inspector Blake frowned. "What happens if consolidation proceeds?" The woman hesitated. "Then one identity ceases to have legal standing." Silence. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Which one?" A long pause followed. Then she said quietly, "The one tied to this place." Inspector Blake frowned. "Witchwood-on-Haven." "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the other?" "The one tied to financial structures will continue under revised registration." Silence followed. Inspector Blake looked between them. "So Mrs. Carter disappears permanently." The woman nodded slowly. "Yes." A pause. "And Daniel?" Her expression changed slightly. "He becomes chapter of the consolidated record." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And what does that mean practically?" The woman hesitated. "He will be legally reassigned under unified identity governance." Inspector Blake frowned. "That sounds like removal from both current contexts." "Yes," she said quietly. Silence filled the space. Daniel arrived moments later. He looked as though he had already heard everything. "I was informed," he said quietly. Inspector Blake turned to him. "And?" Daniel hesitated. "I was told I would be protected." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "Protected from what?" A pause. "From instability," he said. The inspector frowned. "That is not a reassuring explanation." Daniel looked at him. "It is the only one I was given." Silence followed. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Protection often means restructuring," she said. Daniel did not respond, but he did not disagree either. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Inspector Blake sat alone once more. The inspector spoke first. "So this is the end of her dual life." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and yet it feels incomplete," he said. Miss Marple looked at him gently. "Because we are still asking the wrong question." The inspector frowned. "Which is," she replied softly, "not how she lived two lives." A pause. "But why she was never allowed to live one." Silence followed. "Because that question had no administrative answer, only human ones, and those were always harder to obtain." That night, Miss Marple remained awake longer than usual. The structure was collapsing now, not gradually, but decisively. And when systems collapse, she knew, people do not simply lose identities. They lose protection. And what happens next depends on what those identities were protecting from the beginning. Somewhere between Witchwood-on-Haven and Weatherby, a woman who had lived three structured identities was about to become one again. But Miss Marple suspected that one might be the most vulnerable state of all. Chapter 11. the woman who could not be. The morning arrived with an unusual quietness over both Wychwood-on-Haven and Wetherby, as though the entire structure that had held the two places in tension had finally reached its final point of balance, or collapse. Inspector Blake arrived early. He did not sit down immediately. Instead, he placed a single final document on the table. "This is the completed consolidation order," he said. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment before opening it. The language was precise, final, unambiguous. She read silently. Inspector Blake watched her carefully. "Well?" he asked. Miss Marple placed the paper down gently. "It is finished," she said softly. A pause followed. "And irreversible." The inspector exhaled slowly. "So there is no more Evelyn Carter?" Miss Marple nodded. "No." A longer silence followed. "And Evelyn Marsh?" he asked. Miss Marple considered this carefully. "She remains," she said quietly. "But altered." Inspector Blake frowned. "In what way?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Unified registration," she said. "Single legal identity, with absorbed historical records." The inspector looked down. "And Daniel?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "He is included within the unified structure," she said. A pause. "But not as he existed before." Silence settled. "Because that was the real consequence. Not disappearance. Reclassification. Rewriting." Later they went to Wetherby one final time. The bookshop was open again, but quieter than before. Evelyn stood behind the counter, not as two identities, not as a split existence, but as a single settled presence. Still, composed and changed, Inspector Blake spoke first. "It is complete." She nodded once. "Yes."
Miss Marple observed her carefully.
"Do you feel different?"
she asked gently. A pause followed.
"Yes,"
the woman replied. Miss Marple waited.
But no further explanation came. Inspector Blake looked around the shop. "And Daniel?" At the mention of his name, something subtle shifted in the woman's expression. "He has been reassigned under the unified record," she said. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And he understands this?" The woman hesitated. "He understands what he was told." Silence followed, because understanding and acceptance were not the same thing. Inspector Blake spoke quietly. "And Mrs. Carter?" A longer pause. The woman looked down briefly. "Discontinued," she said softly. The word hung in the air. Not death, not departure, but administrative removal of identity. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And do you remember her?" The woman looked up. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. "I remember." "Actions," she said. A pause. "Not separation." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That is what was always intended," she said softly. Silence followed, because now everything had returned to a single point. Not mystery, but design. They left the bookshop quietly. Outside, Inspector Blake finally spoke. "So it was never about deception," he said. Miss Marple walked beside him slowly. "No," she replied. "It was about necessity under constraint." A pause. "And what remains now?" Miss Marple looked ahead at the road between the two villages. "Only what could survive unity," she said softly. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned alone to Wychwood-on-Haven one final time. Mrs. Carter's cottage still stood, quiet, empty, but no longer paused. Now it felt resolved, as though the life once contained within it had been carefully removed rather than abandoned. She stood for a long time at the gate, thinking, not about identities, but about people. Inspector Blake joined her quietly after some time. "She is no longer two people," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "No." A pause. "But she was never really two people," she added softly. The inspector frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked at the cottage. "She was one person," she said gently, "and the world around her required her to be divided in order to function within it." Silence followed, because that was the final truth. Not a woman living two lives, but a woman whose single life had been structured into parts by external necessity until even those around her believed she was divided. Inspector Blake spoke quietly. "So what is the lesson here?" Miss Marple considered for a long moment. then said softly that when life is split too neatly into roles, it is not the person who becomes complicated. A pause. It is the system that becomes dangerous.
The evening light faded slowly over Witchwood-on-Haven, and somewhere beyond it, Weatherby continued unchanged.
But the connection between them had ended. Not with revelation, not with scandal, but with consolidation. And as Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage, she understood something very clearly. Mrs. Evelyn Carter had not been a woman living two lives. She had been a woman whose life had been divided, managed, and maintained until the structure itself required her to exist in fragments. And when that structure finally collapsed, there was no mystery left, only the quiet return of something that had never truly been separate at all.